The neon glow of Murphy's bar cast everything in shades of blue and red on that Friday night in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Rain drummed against the windows, and the jukebox played an old country song nobody was really listening to. The place smelled like cheap beer and fried food, the kind of bar where soldiers came to forget things they couldn't talk about. Captain Sarah Chen sat alone in a corner booth, nursing a ginger ale. Her hair was pulled back tight, and she wore a simple black sweater that couldn't hide the lean muscle underneath, the kind of build you only got from years of training that never really stopped. Her fingers were wrapped around the cold glass, and her eyes were distant, looking at nothing in particular. She had been coming to Murphy's for 3 years. 3 years of deployments, 3 years of leading a team, 3 years of making decisions that kept people alive, and 3 years of people not knowing. The military had changed a lot since the Gulf War. Women served in combat roles now, officially anyway. But the change had been slow, and in some places it hadn't come at all. Fort Bragg was a place where tradition ran deep, where the old guard still held a lot of power, and where a woman in a special operations command was still treated like a mistake someone would fix eventually. Sarah had never expected gratitude. Gratitude wasn't why she did what she did. She did it because people needed to come home alive. She did it because she was good at her job, better than good. She was the best, but being the best meant nothing when people didn't know you existed. That's what hurt the most, not the insults, not the way her commanding officer looked past her in briefings, not the way young men in her unit whispered that she had only made captain because of her last name, because she was a woman, because the military was going soft. What hurt was the silence. The secrecy of special operations meant that most of what she did would never be public. Most of the lives she saved would never know her name. Most of the missions that mattered would stay classified for decades. She had made peace with that years ago. She knew going in that this wasn't the kind of work that made you famous. But she wasn't prepared for the way people at Fort Bragg, people who should have known better, dismissed her. She wasn't ready for the way some of the older officers treated her like she was taking a spot that belonged to a man. She didn't expect her own commanding officer to give credit for her operations to others. 6 months ago, Operation Midnight had gone perfectly. Her team had gone into a compound in Yemen that intelligence had flagged as a terrorist stronghold. 17 people had gone in. 17 people had come out. 0 casualties, 0 collateral damage, perfect execution. The operation had been led by Sarah, planned by Sarah, executed under Sarah's command with flawless precision. At the briefing announcing the success, her commanding officer, Colonel Marcus Harrison, had presented the operation to the base. He had talked about the success. He had named 3 subordinate officers. He had talked about the strong male leadership that made it possible. He had never said Sarah's name. She wasn't bitter. Bitterness was a luxury she couldn't afford, but she was tired. Sarah raised her glass to her lips and took a sip of ginger ale. The bubbles were gone. The drink was warm. She'd been sitting here for an hour, maybe longer. Time worked differently when you were trying to forget. The door to Murphy's bar opened, letting in a gust of cold November wind. 3 men walked in, still in their dress uniforms, still talking loud about whatever had just happened at the officers' club down the street. They were Navy SEALs. Sarah could tell by the bearing, the way they moved, the insignia on their jackets. One of them was tall, with dark hair and the kind of confident stride that came from always being the best in the room. The SEALs found a table near the bar. They ordered beers. They laughed about something one of them said. They were the kind of men who walked through life knowing that the world thought they were heroes. The world was right. Sarah kept her eyes on her warm ginger ale. The tall SEAL kept glancing her way. She pretended not to notice. She had learned a long time ago that looking back usually made things worse. Men like that didn't see women like her unless they were in a position to use them. But then one of the SEALs, a shorter man with reddish hair, pointed at Sarah and said something to his friends. They all laughed. The sound carried across the bar, harsh and mean. Sarah didn't have to hear the words to know what they were laughing about. It was always the same thing. A woman sitting alone, a woman in the military, a woman who probably didn't belong there. She closed her eyes and breathed through it. This was part of the job too, holding it in, staying quiet, not making a scene, being professional even when professionalism wasn't extended to you. The tall SEAL stood up. Sarah heard his chair scrape back. She didn't open her eyes. She hoped he would walk past. She hoped he would leave. She hoped for a lot of things that rarely came true. But he walked straight toward her booth. She could sense him standing there, waiting for her to look at him. She kept her eyes down. "Hey," he said. His voice was calm, almost kind. That was somehow worse. "You're alone tonight." Sarah looked up. He was handsome in that very military way, sharp jaw, confident eyes, the kind of face that appeared in recruitment posters. He was probably in his late 30s. He had probably had doors open for him his whole life. "I am," she said quietly. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. She did mind. Every instinct in her body told her to say no. But saying no to a Navy SEAL, a superior officer in the broader military hierarchy, could mean gossip. It could mean her motivations questioned. It could mean trouble in ways she couldn't control. "Sure," she said. He sat across from her. Up close, she could see his eyes were intelligent. That made it worse somehow. "I'm Travis," he said, extending his hand. "Travis Mitchell, SEAL Team 6. Sarah took his hand. His grip was firm but not aggressive. "Sarah Chen, Army Special Operations Command." Something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, but she caught it. A flicker of recalibration. "Chen," he said slowly. "Captain Chen." "That's right." He leaned back, studying her. For a moment, nobody spoke. The jukebox switched songs. Someone at the bar laughed. The world kept spinning without them. "What's your call sign?" Travis asked finally. Sarah felt her chest tighten. Call signs were sacred. They were earned, not given. They represented something about who you were, what you brought to a team. She had one, but nobody outside her immediate unit knew it. It wasn't the kind of thing you shared with strangers in bars. But something in his eyes, a genuine curiosity, maybe even respect, made her answer. "Shadow 6, she said quietly. Travis Mitchell went completely still. Behind him, Sarah could see his friends had noticed his sudden silence. They were watching now, waiting to see what would happen next. "Shadow 6, Travis repeated slowly, like he was tasting the words. "That's right," Sarah said. Travis stood up. He looked back at his friends. Then he looked at Sarah again, and his expression had changed completely. What had been casual interest had become something else, something that looked like understanding. He walked back to his table. He said something to his friends. Sarah watched as the man with reddish hair, the one who had laughed, went pale. The other SEAL looked like he might be sick. Travis pulled out his phone. He made a call, stepping away from the table. When he came back, he looked at Sarah with new eyes. "You're the one who brought out the Yemen team clean," he said. It wasn't a question. Sarah didn't answer. Operational security meant she couldn't confirm classified missions. But the truth was written all over her face. "Jesus," Travis said softly, "you're Shadow 6. Around the bar, nobody else understood what was happening. But Sarah knew. Somehow, Travis Mitchell knew things that weren't supposed to be known. He knew about operations that should have been buried in classified files. He knew about her, which meant her name, her work, her sacrifice had somehow reached beyond the walls of Fort Bragg. It was the first time in 3 years that anyone had recognized who she really was. And in that moment, sitting in a bar with neon lights and warm ginger ale, Sarah Chen felt something crack inside her, not in a breaking way, but in a way that suggested something larger might finally be visible. Travis Mitchell didn't sit back down. He stood there for a moment, looking at Sarah like she had suddenly transformed into someone completely different. Maybe in his mind she had. Maybe the quiet woman in the black sweater had been replaced by something else. Shadow 6, the operator, the legend. "I need to buy you a drink," he said finally. "A real one, not ginger ale." "I don't drink when I'm working," Sarah said. "You're not working tonight." "I'm always working." Travis smiled at that. It was sad and understanding at the same time. "Yeah," he said, "I know what you mean." He sat back down anyway, this time without asking. His friends stayed at their table, pointedly not watching, which meant they were definitely watching. Sarah's heart was beating faster than it should. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, and this felt dangerous in ways she couldn't quite articulate. "How much do you know?" she asked quietly. "Enough," Travis said. "More than I probably should. I have a friend in the Pentagon. We served together, and after we left active duty, we stayed in touch. He's in Intel now. About a year ago, he was having a drink just like you, and he started talking about this incredible operation in Yemen. He knew I came out of the same command, so he was excited to tell me about it. He said it was the cleanest operation he'd ever seen. Military precision. 0 civilian casualties. Perfect exit." Perfect silence. Sarah felt her stomach twist. That's classified. I know, Travis said. I shouldn't know it. Your friend in Intel shouldn't have told me, but he did because he was impressed. He was talking about who ran it, and he mentioned a name that made me remember something. What name? Sarah asked, even though she knew the answer. Shadow 6, Travis said. He said that was what they called you in your unit, that you had pulled off something in Yemen that would go down in the history books if anyone was ever allowed to know about it. He said your commanding officer tried to take credit for it, but the people who knew the people in your unit, they called you Shadow 6 because you were silent, because you operated in the shadows, because when you showed up, bad things happened to bad people and good people came home alive. Sarah didn't respond. She was processing the fact that her secret wasn't as secret as she thought. She was processing that people on the outside knew about her, people in the Pentagon, people in intelligence agencies. She was processing that her commanding officer's theft of her credit had been noticed by someone with enough power to talk about it. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because tomorrow, everyone's going to know, Travis said. That's why I made a phone call just now. I called my friend at the Pentagon. I told him I just met you in a bar in Fort Bragg and that I thought it was time for the truth to come out. I told him that having the best operator in the command be unknown and underappreciated was a waste of military resources. And I told him that Colonel Harrison taking credit for Shadow 6's work was the kind of thing that needed to be addressed. Sarah felt the room spin a little. What did he say? He said he'd been waiting for someone to make that call, Travis said. He said he'd tried to push it internally, but it kept getting blocked at higher levels. He said someone wanted to keep you quiet. And he said he'd be very interested in having a conversation with you, a formal conversation about everything you've done. I can't talk about classified operations, Sarah said. Not in public, Travis agreed. But there are ways, there are debriefings, official inquiries, reviews. There are paths that exist within the system for the truth to come out when something wrong has happened. What happened to you, your work being stolen, your sacrifice being erased, that's wrong. And my friend wants to help make it right. Sarah looked at Travis Mitchell, this Navy SEAL she had never met until an hour ago, who was now appending everything she thought she knew about how the world worked. Why would you do this? She asked. Why would you risk whatever political capital you have to help someone you don't know? Because I know what it's like to be invisible, Travis said. Because I know what it's like to do something that matters and have nobody know your name. Because my wife was in the Navy and she faced some of the same things you're facing. And because the military only survives if we take care of our own. If we let that system break down, if we let people like you get erased, then we don't deserve to exist. There was conviction in his voice, the kind of conviction that couldn't be faked. Sarah had spent years reading people in high-stress situations. She knew how to detect lies, how to spot manipulation, how to sense deception. She didn't sense any of that from Travis Mitchell. What she sensed was integrity. That night after Travis left, after he had given her a phone number and told her to call his friend in the morning, Sarah went home to her small apartment on the base. She sat in the dark for a long time, staring at the phone number on a bar napkin. She thought about everything she had given to the military. She thought about the days she missed. She thought about the lives she had saved and the weight of those lives, the responsibility of knowing that if she had made one wrong decision, 17 people would have died. She thought about Operation Midnight and every moment of that mission, every call she made, every decision that led to a perfect outcome. And she thought about Colonel Marcus Harrison giving that briefing, nomming other people, taking credit for something he hadn't done. At 6 a.m. the next morning, Sarah called the number on the napkin. The man who answered was named David Torres, and he worked in the Pentagon's Special Operations Command Review Board. He sounded unsurprised to hear from her, like he had been waiting by the phone. Captain Chen, he said, I've been expecting your call. Can you come to Washington? I have a meeting arranged for tomorrow. I think it's time we talked about Shadow 6. The next day, Sarah sat in a conference room in the Pentagon with 2 lawyers, 2 generals, and David Torres. She told them everything. She talked about Operation Midnight. She talked about the planning, the execution, the decisions she made in real time that brought everyone home safe. She talked about the briefing where Colonel Harrison took credit. She talked about the pattern of being overlooked, underappreciated, and erased from the narrative of her own work. And as she spoke, she watched their faces change. She watched them realize the scope of what had happened. She watched them understand that this wasn't just a case of stolen glory, this was a systematic failure in the chain of command. By that evening, An official inquiry had been opened into Colonel Harrison's conduct. By the next morning, the story had leaked to the press. The New York Times headline read, "Shadow 6, the female special operations officer the Pentagon tried to hide." The Washington Post called it, "Erasure and Excellence, How the Military System Failed Its Best Operator." Every major news outlet picked up the story. Cable news networks ran segments about it. Talk shows debated it. Social media exploded with the revelation that the most successful recent special operations mission had been led by a woman whose commanding officer had systematically removed her from official reports. Sarah watched it all from a secure facility at Fort Bragg. The military had put her under protective orders, not because she needed protection, but because of what came next. Colonel Marcus Harrison was suspended pending investigation. Internal Affairs opened a formal inquiry into his conduct over the past 3 years. Journalists started digging into his record, finding patterns of behavior, other operations where credit had been misaligned, other officers, mostly women, whose work had been underappreciated or misattributed. The military had a woman problem, the stories said. The system was broken, they said. But one woman, a woman named Sarah Chen, call sign Shadow 6, was forcing it to reckon with itself. For Sarah, it was both vindication and nightmare. She couldn't leave the base without security. Journalists camped outside the gates. Her mother, who lived in California, had reporters ringing her doorbell asking for comments. Friends from college reached out, saying they'd seen the news, asking if she wanted to do interviews, book deals, speaking tour. She said no to all of it. The thing nobody understood, the thing that never made it into the news stories, was that Sarah didn't want to be famous. She didn't want to be a symbol or a figurehead or proof that women could do the job. She had never done any of it for recognition. She had done it because the work mattered. And the work was still there. Operations didn't stop because a commanding officer had behaved badly. The world didn't become safer because the truth came out. People still needed to be rescued. Bad actors still needed to be stopped. The machinery of special operations still required people willing to operate in the shadows, do the work that couldn't be credited, make decisions that no one else would have to know about. 2 weeks after the story broke, Sarah's new commanding officer, General Patricia Morrison, called her into her office. General Morrison was different from Colonel Harrison. She was sharp, direct, and had no patience for politics. She had been brought in specifically to stabilize the command after the scandal. "Captain Chen," she said, not standing up, just gesturing to a chair. "Sit." Sarah sat. "I'm going to be honest with you," General Morrison said. "Everything you did was correct. Everything in that inquiry confirms that you operated at the highest levels of military excellence. You're exceptional and the system failed you. I don't say that lightly. We are going to spend the next months or years undoing the damage that was done, not just to you, but to the culture of this command." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah said. "But I need to know something," General Morrison continued. "Do you want to stay? Because I suspect you've had offers, book deals, speaking opportunities, positions in the private sector. You could walk away right now and build a life where you're recognized for what you've accomplished. Nobody would blame you." Sarah thought about that. She thought about the book deals that were sitting on her agent's desk. She thought about the universities that had offered her positions as a lecturer. She thought about the private security companies that had sent letters of interest. She thought about how easy it would be to leave. "What's the alternative?" Sarah asked. "Stay," General Morrison said. "Let me rebuild this command. Let me use your expertise to change how we operate, how we recruit, how we develop our people. And let me make sure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else again. You'd be a major part of that, but it would mean continuing to operate in the shadows. It would mean never getting public credit for what comes next. It would mean continuing to be invisible." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then she asked, "What do you need me to do?" General Morrison smiled. It was the first time Sarah had seen her smile. "I need you to tell me the truth, about everything, about how this command works where it's broken, how we fix it. I need you to help me change things from the inside." "And Colonel Harrison?" Sarah asked. "He'll face military justice," General Morrison said. "But Captain Chen, understand this. His punishment won't be enough for you. No verdict, no sentence, no public apology will give you back the 3 years you lost. Revenge won't heal that. Only moving forward will." Sarah nodded. She understood. Revenge was a poison that only hurt the person holding the cup. Over the next 3 months, Sarah became an unofficial advisor to General Morrison. She walked the halls of Fort Bragg in a new capacity, not as the invisible operator, but as someone helping to reshape how the command trained, recruited, and developed its people. And bit by bit, things changed. New protocols were implemented for crediting operations. New pathways were created for women and minorities in special operations. New mentorship programs were established. The culture started to shift, slowly, because military culture moved slowly, but it shifted. Other women came forward with their own stories. Some had been treated the way Sarah had. Some had experienced worse. The flood of truth was uncomfortable, but it was necessary. Colonel Harrison's trial was closed to the press, but the findings were eventually declassified in part. He was convicted of dereliction of duty, conduct unbecoming an officer, and fraud. He was dishonorably discharged. The New York Times wrote a follow-up story. Shadow 6 doesn't want your apology. In the article, Sarah gave one interview. She said that she didn't do what she did for thanks or recognition. She said that the military was a team sport, and teams only worked when everyone was valued. She said that her hope was that younger women coming into the military would see that paths were opening, that barriers were breaking down, that they could be fully visible in their work and celebrated for it. But she also said something that surprised the reporter. "I'm a soldier first," she said. "That hasn't changed. The publicity, the investigation, the trial, none of that is what I care about. What I care about is whether we're training better operators, whether we're saving more lives, whether the people under my command feel valued and respected. That's always been the mission. That will always be the mission." When the article was published, something interesting happened. The military community, the tight-knit world of special operations, the officers and enlisted personnel who lived and breathed this life, began to see Sarah differently. She wasn't the victim of the scandal. She wasn't the symbol of change. She was what she had always been, a soldier doing her job better than almost anyone else. 6 months after the scandal broke, Sarah stood in front of a classroom of 32 soldiers in the combat training facility at Fort Bragg. They were the newest class of special operations recruits, the cream of the crop, the people who had passed the brutal selection process and were now ready for advanced training. Half of them were men, half were women. It was a visible symbol of how much had changed in 6 months. Sarah looked at their faces, young, determined, scared. They reminded her of herself at that age, though she had come up through a different system, a closed system, a system where barriers had been less visible but no less real. "My name is Captain Sarah Chen," she said. "Some of you might have heard that name in the news. Forget what you heard, forget the headlines, all of that is noise." She paused, letting her gaze move across the room. "What matters is this. We are going to spend the next weeks training you to operate in chaos. We're going to teach you to make decisions when lives depend on those decisions. We're going to test your limits and push you past them. We're going to see who has the mental and physical toughness to do this job." She walked to the side of the classroom, her movements precise. "And I'm going to tell you something you won't hear anywhere else. Some of you are going to fail. Some of you won't make it. That has nothing to do with whether you're male or female, what your background is, where you come from. It has to do with whether you're willing to sacrifice. It has to do with whether you can think clearly when everything is chaos. It has to do with whether you care more about the mission than you care about yourself." One of the recruits, a young woman in the back, had her hand up. "Yes," Sarah said. "Ma'am, is it harder for women to make it in this command?" the woman asked. Sarah didn't hesitate. "It used to be," she said. "For years, the system was built to make it harder. Things are changing, but change is slow. You're going to face people who don't believe you belong here. You're going to face moments where you question yourself. You're going to have to work harder to get the same recognition. But here's what's also true. Every single one of you who makes it through this process is going to be extraordinary. And you're going to walk into a command that, finally, understands your value." After the class ended, the young woman from the back approached Sarah. "Captain Chen, I'm Recruit Martinez," she said. "I wanted to say that your story, it mattered. My mother saw it on the news. She told me that if I wanted this, if I really wanted this, I could do it, that there were women who had done it before. She told me your story gave her hope that I could do this." Sarah felt something shift in her chest. This was the part that the news stories had missed. This was the part that mattered. "Thank you for telling me that," Sarah said. "Now prove her right. You've got 8 weeks of selection ahead of you. It's going to be the hardest thing you've ever done. but if you're willing to pay the price, we'll get you through it. That evening, Sarah had dinner with her mother for the first time since the scandal broke. Her mother, Margaret Chen, had driven from California and was staying at a hotel near the base. Sarah hadn't seen her in person for nearly 2 years. The deployments had made long visits impossible. The classified work had made phone calls brief and guarded. Sitting across from her mother in a restaurant outside the base, Sarah suddenly felt very young. Her mother was in her 70s now, her hair entirely gray, her hands a little shakier than Sarah remembered. The weight of her own life, the distance she had maintained to protect her mother from the dangers of her work, suddenly felt like too much space. "I was so worried," her mother said, reaching across the table and holding Sarah's hand. "When I saw the news, when I realized what had been happening to you, I wanted to come right away, but you were under security lockdown." "I know, Mom," Sarah said. "I'm sorry I couldn't call more." "You have nothing to apologize for," her mother said. "What you do, who you are, I'm proud of you. I've always been proud of you, but I'm also glad the world finally knows it too." "The world knowing doesn't change the work," Sarah said. "It just makes it noisier." "Yes," her mother agreed, "but it also protects you. When people know who you are, when they know what you can do, it's harder for them to hurt you in the dark. Visibility is a kind of protection." They ate dinner and talked about other things, family members, Sarah's childhood, the apartment her mother lived in back home. For a few hours, Sarah wasn't Shadow 6. She was just Sarah, a daughter having dinner with her mother. But as the evening ended and Sarah drove her mother back to her hotel, she thought about what her mother had said. Visibility as protection. It was true that the publicity had created a kind of shield. She couldn't be easily dismissed or forgotten now, but it had also complicated everything. She thought about the choice General Morrison had asked her to make, whether to stay and help change the system from the inside, or to walk away and build a different life. She had chosen to stay. She was still choosing to stay every single day. But staying meant living in a different kind of invisibility. It meant that all the work she was doing now, the training, the mentoring, the quiet restructuring of how the command operated, would never be public. It meant that her next achievement would be known only to those inside the system. It meant returning, in a sense, to the shadows. The difference was that now, she was choosing the shadows. She was choosing them because the work that happened in the shadows mattered more than the work that happened in the light. That was the real lesson of Shadow 6. Not that she had been treated unfairly. Not that the system needed to change. Not that women belonged in special operations. They always had, and they always would. The real lesson was about sacrifice. It was about doing something that mattered, knowing that most of the people you saved would never know your name. It was about being excellent in private, in the dark, in the quiet spaces where most people would never look. As Sarah drove back to her apartment on the base, she felt something settle inside her. Not peace exactly, she was never going to have complete peace, but something like acceptance. She had paid a price for her excellence. The system had tried to erase her. That was wrong and it had been addressed, but the price was still real. The cost of excellence was loneliness. The cost of sacrifice was invisibility. The cost of doing the work that mattered most was knowing that the world would never fully understand what you had given up to do it. And Sarah Chen was okay with that. She had made her choice. She was going to stay in the shadows. She was going to keep training soldiers. She was going to keep pushing the system to change from the inside. She was going to keep making decisions in the dark that would keep people alive in the light. Shadow 6 had become visible for just long enough for the truth to come out. 1 year after the scandal, Sarah was standing in the observation room at Fort Bragg, watching the final exercises of a selection class. She was not supposed to be here. General Morrison had ordered her to take a week of leave. Sarah had argued that she could observe. General Morrison had been firm, rest, real rest, or Sarah would be removed from duty. So Sarah had compromised. She came in after hours, after the official observers had gone home, and watched the soldiers push themselves through the most difficult training the military could offer. There was recruit Martinez, the young woman who had approached her in that first classroom. Martinez was running an obstacle course with a heavy pack on her back, her face twisted with determination. She was near the end of the selection process. She would make it. Sarah could see it in how she moved, how she problem-solved each obstacle, how she refused to quit even when her body was screaming. The young men in the class were being pushed just as hard. That was important. That was the point. There was no difference in the standard. There was only the standard, and you either met it or you didn't. A voice behind Sarah made her turn. It was Travis Mitchell. He was standing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing her a cup. "I'm supposed to be on leave," Sarah said. "I know," Travis said. "I ran into General Morrison at the Pentagon. She told me to tell you to go home. I told her I'd track you down and make sure you actually went. I'm apparently very persuasive." Sarah took the coffee and smiled slightly. Travis had become something unexpected, a friend. After the scandal, after everything had blown open, Travis had stayed in touch. He had checked in regularly, made sure she was okay, reminded her that there were people who understood what she was going through. They stood in silence for a while, watching the recruits work. "They're good," Travis said finally. "This class is going to be something special, Martinez especially." "She will be," Sarah agreed. "You did that," Travis said. "You changed the system. You made it possible for women like her to be here to have a real shot." "The system changed itself," Sarah said. "I just lit a match." "No," Travis said. "You did more than that. You sacrificed your anonymity so that others could have visibility. You took the wound publicly so that the wound could heal." Sarah didn't respond. She didn't like thinking of it in those terms. She didn't like the idea that her pain had a purpose, that her suffering had been necessary. But maybe Travis was right. Maybe that was true and she just didn't like accepting it. "Have you thought about what's next?" Travis asked. Sarah had thought about it constantly. Her commitment to the military had been about serving, but her eyes had been opened in the past year to other possibilities. General Morrison had suggested she might be ready for a command position, leading an entire operation or team. The Pentagon had hinted that there were positions available in policy and planning. A private security firm had made an offer that would have made her wealthy. "I'm going to stay," Sarah said. "For now. General Morrison wants to establish a new division focused on training and recruitment. She's asked me to help lead it. I want to see if I can make a difference that way." "Leading from behind," Travis said. "Something like that." They watched Martinez complete the obstacle course. She sat down hard when she finished, her chest heaving, sweat pouring off her. But she was smiling. Sarah could see it even from a distance, that smile of someone who had pushed themselves to the absolute limit and discovered they could survive it. "You know what I realized?" Travis said. "After everything came out, after all the publicity died down, I realized what makes you actually special. It's not that you're tougher than other people. It's not that you make better decisions. It's that you can live with not being recognized. You can do the most important work and not need the applause. That's rarer than military excellence. That's just rare as a human quality." Sarah turned to look at him. "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation," Travis said. "Take it however you want." They finished their coffee in silence. The exercise below ended and the recruits were dismissed. Slowly, the training ground emptied out. Lights flickered off. The stars came out above Fort Bragg, the same stars that had looked down on this place for hundreds of years. "Go home," Travis said finally. "Get some rest. When you come back, you can change the world again." Sarah did go home. She went to her apartment and slept for 12 hours straight. She woke up and read books for pleasure, something she hadn't done in years. She thought about her life, not the public narrative of Shadow 6, but the actual, ordinary, complicated life of Sarah Chen. She thought about the choices she had made. She thought about the price she had paid. She thought about what was coming next. On her last day of leave, Sarah visited a memorial. It was a quiet place, a small park on the edge of Fort Bragg where names were engraved. Not all names, because most of the people whose names should be there couldn't be named. But the empty space, the unspoken acknowledgement of all the work that happened in classified darkness, was important. Sarah didn't come here often. These kinds of places brought up too much, but today she came to think. She stood in front of the stone and remembered Operation Midnight. She remembered every decision, every moment. She remembered the weight of 17 lives in her hands. She remembered the moment they had cleared the compound, when she had known, absolutely, that everyone was coming home. And she remembered the briefing, where that victory had been credited to someone else. The healing had happened in a sense. Justice had been served in a legal and administrative sense. Colonel Harrison had been dishonorably discharged. The system had acknowledged its failure. Change was happening. But the wound was still there. It would always be there. Some things, once they happened, couldn't be fully undone. Sarah had come to understand that this was part of being human. It wasn't unique to her experience. Everyone carried wounds. Everyone had been wronged in some way. Everyone had sacrificed something and never been thanked for it. The question was what you did with that knowledge. You could let it poison you. You could spend your life looking for revenge or recognition. You could make bitterness your defining characteristic. Or you could accept it. You could acknowledge that the world was unfair, that the system was broken, that sometimes excellence went unrecognized. And then you could keep working. You could keep trying to make things better. You could keep showing up. That was the real meaning of Shadow 6. It wasn't about being silent because you had no choice. It was about being silent because you understood that the work itself was the point. Sarah left the memorial and drove back to base. She packed up her leave and prepared to go back to work. The new division was waiting. The recruits needed training. The system needed changing. General Morrison had asked her to give a speech at the graduation ceremony for the next class of Special Operations soldiers. It would be her first public appearance since the scandal had died down. Sarah had agreed, though the thought made her nervous. The day of the ceremony came. Sarah stood backstage, her dress uniform crisp, her hair pulled back the way it always was. General Morrison was already speaking, talking about the excellence of the class, the rigor of the training, the sacrifices these soldiers had made. Then General Morrison said her name. "And I want to introduce someone who has shaped this class more than anyone else, Captain Sarah Chen, Shadow 6. Sarah walked onto the stage. The soldiers rose to their feet. Sarah hadn't been expecting that. She had thought they would applaud, but the standing ovation took her by surprise. Young men and women, people who had just pushed themselves through the hardest training of their lives, were standing for her. Sarah stood at the podium and looked at their faces. Recruit Martinez was there, tears streaming down her face. The young men Sarah had trained were there, nodding with respect. These were her soldiers. These were the people who would go into the field and do the work that mattered. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly. "But you should know something. Standing ovations, public recognition, those things are nice. But they're not why we do this. We do this because people's lives depend on us doing it. We do this because there are people in the world who need us and they never asked for our names. They don't care about our publicity or our awards. They just need us to be excellent. They need us to be silent. They need us to show up and do the work that matters." She paused, collecting her thoughts. "I spent 3 years doing work that nobody knew about. My command tried to erase that work. That was wrong. But here's what I learned. The work itself was never about being recognized. The work was about being done right. The work was about bringing people home alive. The work was about being better than the people who wanted to hurt us." Sarah looked directly at the young soldiers. "You are going to do extraordinary things. Most of the world will never know about them. Most of your friends and family will never understand what you did or why you did it. And that's okay, because you will know. You will know that you were excellent when it mattered most, and that's enough." The speech ended and Sarah walked back off stage. The standing ovation continued, but she didn't hear it. She was thinking about what came next, about the work that was waiting, about the difference she could still make if she stayed focused, if she kept working, if she didn't lose sight of why she had chosen this life. After the ceremony, as soldiers lined up to shake her hand, Sarah noticed something. Recruit Martinez approached her last. "Captain Chen," Martinez said, "I wanted you to know that I made it. I'm staying on. I'm going into SOAR, Special Operations Aviation Regiment. I'm going to be a pilot in Special Operations." Sarah smiled. "That's an extraordinary choice, Martinez. Why?" "Because you showed me that excellence wasn't about being recognized," Martinez said. "You showed me that being invisible and being important weren't mutually exclusive. You showed me I could do something that mattered without the world knowing my name, and I wanted to do that." After Martinez left, Sarah stood alone for a moment in the hallway. She thought about the ripple effects of choosing to be silent, of choosing to do the work without needing credit. She thought about how that choice inspired others to make the same choice. And she thought about how the real victory wasn't Colonel Harrison being discharged. The real victory was a young woman named Martinez deciding to dedicate her life to work that the world might never know about. That night, Sarah went back to Murphy's bar. She ordered a ginger ale and sat in the same booth where Travis Mitchell had asked her call sign a year ago. The bar looked the same as it always had, neon and noise and the smell of fried food. But everything was different now. Sarah looked at her reflection in the glass of her drink. She saw a woman who had been wronged and had lived through the injustice of it. She saw a woman who had chosen to stay and fight from the inside rather than walk away. She saw a woman who understood that the most important work happened in the shadows, in the silence, in the places where nobody would ever say thank you. And she was okay with that. Shadow 6 would fade back into the shadows, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Because she had finally learned that the work itself was the only reward that mattered. She raised her ginger ale in a silent toast, to the work that nobody knew about, to the lives saved in darkness, to the decisions made in silence that changed the world for people who would never know her name. To Shadow 6, and to all the soldiers who walked in her footsteps, choosing excellence over recognition, sacrifice over credit, the work over the reward. The bar hummed with noise around her, but Sarah sat in her own silence, at peace with her choice, ready for what came next. The real victory was already won. It had been won the moment she decided to stay.